This week for our intermediate watercolor, we are gathering inspiration from one of my favorite artists, Georgia O'Keeffe. She is an American artist who is known for viewing items up close, looking at pieces of a whole. And so we're going to do that with our piece that we're going to create this week together. I want to start by looking at an example of hers. This is just a leaf, but she believed in getting up close and zooming, and when you do that to just an ordinary object, it becomes extraordinary. So she zooms in and she focuses on the lines that create the object and the colors. And that's what we're going to do as well. We're going to zoom up or look closely at nature around us. When we do that, maybe we are looking at a specific piece. So if we were using this poppy as an example, and she painted poppies frequently, it was one of her favorites. But if we were going to look at this poppy, then we could use this photo and focus on the largeness of this piece. And maybe we would not even worry about the area around the poppy, just focusing on the positive space and zooming in to the colors that we see, the shadows, the highlights, the lines that we see that those areas create. Maybe we're focusing on the contour, the outline of the flower. So there's so much to think about whenever you're getting ready to start a piece. But this week you're going to choose a piece from nature. It can be a flower. It can be something simple like a leaf, like Georgia did with this autumn leaf, changing colors. I am actually going to, using Georgia O'Keeffe as my inspiration, I'm going to actually use something that's very common to this part of West Texas, the agave americana, or what some of us call the century plant. So this is the bottom of the century plant, and then from the bottom grows a stalk, and then at a certain time the stalk starts to flower and bloom, and it creates this beautiful stem, very strong, sturdy stem in the middle, and then these branches, I call them branches, but that come out with the blooms. And what I love about it is that it's almost like a dance. It's this side, and then you move up some this side, and it goes back and forth. So I have a specific picture that I'm going to be working from that I love. And I'm not concerned about this whole piece. If you'll notice, I have pre-cut a square for you. So if you're working from a rectangular piece, that's not going to work. The dimensions would be very weird or exaggerated to fit this rectangular piece onto this square piece. I'm going to actually zoom in. I'm not going to worry at all about the mountains of Big Bend in the back. I'm not going to worry about the Ocotillo, even though I love Ocotillo. I am just going to focus on the stem here, and then the pieces coming out with the blooming flowers. So I'm going to use this as my inspiration, and I'm going to zoom close in the style of Georgia O'Keeffe. I'm going to start with my stem over here. And remember, we're just sketching light. I want to be able to get this part here. So I'm going to make sure that I have enough space, that I don't run out. A good way to start is to sketch on another piece of paper before you come to this bigger piece, your main piece. And when you're sketching, you're just following the lines that you see. This is part of training your eye to follow the contour lines. We have practiced that in class so many different times. Notice that I am not, as I'm sketching, I'm not getting detailed. I'm not getting detailed with my blooms at all. I'm just showing the basic sketch of where that bloom is going to be in relation to what I'm creating. And starting at the top and then moving down, that's not typically how I work, but to be able to get that top piece here on my paper, I need to make sure that I have room for that. I'm noticing that as I'm sketching, this seems to curve. I would have to get up close to see if that's really what is happening. But the way I'm viewing the photograph, that is what it's looking like to be. take some time to continue looking up close at your photograph and sketching it onto your paper. So you've taken some time to sketch your piece, whether you started on a scratch piece of paper, whether you started on the paper that I've pre-cut for you. You are going off of a photo that you've come up with. And remember, our inspiration is Georgia O'Keeffe, and Georgia looked up close. So if you're choosing maybe a piece of a flower and you've zoomed in, or you found a picture that was already, the photographer has already zoomed up close, then you are sketching that onto your paper. You're giving yourself some guidelines. You're drawing those contour lines and breaking your space into the color shapes, the organic color shapes that you're seeing. Okay, so this is the dark purple area and this is the dark purple area. This is the green part, this is the green part. This is the beautiful yellow inside of the iris here, the white coming down, and then the lighter purple coming out. The yellow coming up with the lines coming out, the petal. And then this under section that's kind of blurry and dark is here, and then this dark section here. So you have filled your space with all of the flower. Okay, so now we're going to come back to my piece, and we are going to get started on the painting part. I have done the same thing. I've taken a photograph that I love, and I absolutely love when the agave americana starts to bloom, and I loved the green and yellow set against the blue. So I've zoomed in on this photo just like I showed you on the other piece, and I have sketched that onto my paper. I am now going to start with my front parts, and I'm actually going to do my lime greens first. My yellow greens. We are using a semi-moist paint. You can see that right now it's not coming off onto my finger. It's not had any moisture added to it, and so just a very simple watercolor palette, but we can get more than just the colors seen here by combining them onto our paper. And we've got a cold press paper. This cold press paper is able to handle a little bit more than what you would normally get from just a regular paper. So on my drawing, I have areas when I'm looking at my photograph, and you should also be looking at your photograph, whether it is a flower detail that you're looking at on your phone. However that may be, you should be looking at that to see your colors and working from that to create your colors. Now, I am not necessarily interested in getting every single color on this piece exactly the same as my photograph. That's what the photograph is for. I'm creating a piece that just kind of speaks to me. So I'm going to use the photograph as guidance, but I'm not going to base my colors only on that. So now I'm going to come back with some green on top of my yellow to get more of a bright green. I put my yellow down first, using it kind of as a highlight. Just barely dipping the tip of my brush. If you put your color on and it's too strong, then just move it around to where you want it to be. Notice that I'm working in small sections. I'm not trying to cover a large area. At this moment, I'm putting my yellow down first, and then I'm coming back with my green on top. When I look at my photo, I can see that there are shadows based on where the light source, which is the sun in this photograph, the light source is shining onto the blooms, and so that gives me these darker shadow areas. And so I also have some highlights on the branches that I've used my my pencil to kind of give me those lines, so I know kind of where I'm headed. So now I'm going to come back to my yellow and continue down. I'm referencing my photo back and forth, just making sure that I am not painting in the wrong spot, especially whenever you have some intricate areas and you want to make sure that you're getting your color laid down where you need it to be. And I'm going to come back with my green. If you're having a hard time getting started and you're looking at your piece and you're just like, I really have no idea, really let the photo, let the flower tell you what to do. If we were to look back at this iris and the photo on the phone, then we would know that this whole area would be that dark purple. And then we would know that this area would need to be yellow. And then down here we would have purple that was watered down so we could get those lighter striations with the lines. So you're really letting the photo guide you. You're letting the colors and the shapes that they make give you ideas of what you need to be doing. On this piece, I would have just a regular red, and maybe I would even add a little bit of orange to these lighter areas. So I could have the orange here and these highlights, and then regular red here, and then I would come back on top with my red again to get these darker areas. So you're really looking up close and you're looking carefully at your piece and letting it tell you where the colors need to be. We are not trying to be super detailed on this piece. This is, you can see on my blooms, I have not shown every little flower. The blooms of the agave americana, these are actually little flowers. Okay, that's not necessarily my concern for this piece. That is not what I'm interested in doing. So now I'm going to come back and start with my shadow. I really could use black for this piece. I feel like it really that is what we see in the photo. And what I'm going to do instead is use purple. So I'm going to come first and add this green here. Then come back with my purple. So I am just barely dipping the tip of my brush into my paint and coming to the areas where I see my purple shade. You can see that in certain parts it's blending. If you do not like when those colors blend together, then you'll need to wait until your first color is dry, and a really easy way of doing that is just by going to a different section of your piece and working in that different section. Just coming back, and I'm personally going to control some of my color a little bit more. This is an intermediate watercolor. If you have drawn with me, painted with me over time, and you still feel like that this is not something that you are interested in trying, then just use the paper this week to create beautiful colors with your watercolor. So I'm going to take a moment and let these sections, my purple sections, dry, and I'm going to come back and give some interest to my main stem here. I love how I'm able to layer color on top of color to build the color. And part of that is just painting and trying things, trying new things. If you fail the first time, then you'll know that that's not something that you want to try next time. I'm going to come back with some of my blue on some of my purple areas. This is also a fun way to practice your color wheel, because you're finding that when you add blue and purple, that you are creating a blue purple, and so you're moving from the primary colors, you're moving from the secondary colors into more of the third color, which is tertiary, and you're getting to see what happens when you add some of those colors together. You will find that maybe some of the areas that you weren't so happy about, once you continue adding your layers of color, that you're like, oh, okay, that's a little more where I was headed. So some of my blue areas I'm bringing in to fix the blending of my purple with my wet green. Which is not horrible, but it was creating more of a brown that I wasn't really interested in. I have some more areas right here that I need to work on, but that part of my paper is really wet, so I'm going to let that dry for a little bit, and I'll join you back in just a little bit. Continue working on looking at your photo, looking at the lights and the darks, your value, and then see how you want to translate that onto your piece. So you have continued adding color. Maybe you are just working with one color value of red, and so you're using regular red, a red orange, and then a layered darker red to create your value. Maybe on the piece that I sketched, the up close O'Keeffe iris, maybe you have the value of the dark purple and then the watered down lighter purple here with this bright yellow popping in certain places. I've continued adding color to my close-up of my century plant, and I am using my yellow first and then putting my green on top to make this lime green color, and I'm using my purples and blues as my shadows, and I also have this blue here on top of my lime green to create just a different green and more of an interest there. So I'm not getting super detailed. When you look at Georgia O'Keeffe pieces, especially her watercolors or her up close pieces, it's an abstraction. Okay, so an abstraction means that there are lines. You know that when you're looking at it for most of her pieces, you know that this is going to be a flower. The abstraction comes in that she doesn't give you every single little detail. When you look at the leaf, you are not seeing every single little crack or surface of these veins. We know that whenever we look up close to leaves, even my hand here, we can see up close and we can see really small details like veining in the leaves and the texture of our skin. We're not concerned about that on this piece. This is an abstraction. We are giving the idea of what this is. So I have come back to my flowering areas of the agave americana, and now I'm going to come and I've worked on some of these highlighted areas, and now I'm going to come back to some of my shadowed areas. I could have used a black for this, and maybe I will redo this at some point and try it a different way. But for what I wanted to do today, I wanted these bright kind of vibrant colors, and so I used my purples and my blues as my shadowed areas, and I'm going to continue that. So whatever I have here, I'm going to continue on up here. Whatever I have here on this part of the stem, I'm going to bring on up, and so on and so forth. You can see in certain areas that I've left open spaces. So I've done that specifically to come back with these darker shadowed areas to work in. So I'm going to start just dipping just a little bit with my water and going into my purple. I'm going to come here and add more of this area. So when I look at these blooms, I'm looking at the parts of the flowers that are being held together, and that is what I'm creating now on this stem part. I'm going to come back over here and fill in this space, and you can see that I've worked in kind of blocked areas, and I've specifically done this because that helps me know where I'm putting this next layer of color, and it gives me an idea of where these colors are going to be laid down. So I'm starting with my purples, and you can see it's really just flowing nicely from the color that I've put down earlier to the color that I'm doing now. And since I have purple on my brush, I'm just going to continue looking around. This area is a little too wet, so I'm going to wait for that. I can come down here and continue this purple. So I'm giving the idea of the stem areas where the flowers are coming off of the stem, off of these little branches, and then they have these pods that they're coming out of. I'm sure that that is not the technical term, but and sometimes you might have watched earlier and you were like, I'm not sure where you're going with this. Why? I'm not sure what's happening with the purples where you've put your shadows. And so as I'm coming back and as I'm starting to add some of this shadow detail and starting to build these pod areas, then you can see how it's starting to come together. Maybe you're doing the same thing. Maybe you're feeling the same way with your flower that you've chosen. Maybe you've done a section and you're like, I'm not sure how this is supposed to work out. Just keep going. And you know, if you get to the part where it is just not working for you, then you've learned from that, and you can come back around to it, let it dry, try something different. Or maybe you'll decide to completely start again. Remember that as you're working, you can move some of the color around. So I have not re-dipped into my purple this whole time. And I have some darker areas, and I'm just taking my brush and getting that to the area that I want it to be. Some of my areas are so dark, so I'm able just to give the idea of that shadow. Come back down to some of these areas that I can work on now. looking back and forth, I'm taking moments to look at my piece, making sure that I call this color blocking, because I'm just looking at the color values and where they are on my piece. I'm gonna come back around to this green. I'm gonna bring just a regular green up for this part. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to start with my blue. Get that darker kind of blue-green. Shadow on this one, and I'm going to come back over that just a touch because it kind of grayed out a little bit as it was drying. Now that this section is dry, I'm able to come back around and work on some of that area that I didn't like as much. From when it was mixing on me. It's the beauty of watercolor. Okay, so now I'm going to come back on top and add some of the dimension, the blue dimension, to my purple. So we have continued building our color. We are creating an abstraction of something that we're looking up close in the style of Georgia O'Keeffe. And I'm kind of at a stopping point for today. I'm going to add a little bit more to my blooms, but I need to make sure that everything that I've done so far is dry before I move on to any touch-ups that I need to do, and then finally the background. So I'm going to re-wet my brush and come over to my yellow, and I'm going to add the tips of my blooms with this bright yellow. Some of my shadowed areas are still not completely dry, so I'm not going to get super close. Another reason why sometimes when you're working with watercolor you need to just take a step back and let your piece sit for a little bit. And we're going to actually do that with this piece. Especially when I have so many different areas that are still kind of wet. When I look at the blooms of the century plant, no matter where the branches are going, whether they're going up or down, the blooms are pointing up. Okay, so that's something to, if you're trying something similar to me, that's something to be aware of, that your blooms are going to be pointing up. And if you are working on a floral piece, maybe you chose a different cactus to work on. Just make sure that you're looking back and forth at your the lines that the piece is giving you. So what is it telling you? What are your contour lines telling you? And I'm just using my brush, I'm holding it firmly, and I'm giving kind of straight, I'm not painting in long lines. I'm giving straight little quick brush strokes to give the idea of these blooms, these flowering blooms around my stems and where they're coming out from. And then I'm going to finish for today on this kind of large area here. And today with the yellow, yes, the blooms are a yellow color or hue. I'm just laying down some of that, giving it a little bit of texture with my brush marks. And I'm going to let that dry, and then whenever I come back the next time, I'm going to take care of some of these areas where my colors kind of blended or exploded a little bit more than what I care for, And then we'll come back and add some more detail to the bloom area before we start on our background. Make sure you are setting your piece in a safe place for it to dry, where nothing's gonna mess with it or mess it up during the drying process. And also make sure you're taking care of your supplies, washing your brush, carefully bringing it to a point, and letting it dry for its next usage.